You are walking through the forest. It is a morning in late autumn. 10,000 years ago, and you have been foraging since before the sun came up. The light is good now, filtering through the birch canopy in long flat strips. And you can see clearly. You are not afraid. You have walked this forest your entire life. You know its sounds and its silences, and the specific quality of attention that the birds use when something is wrong. Then your hand catches a thorn, a small one. You barely feel it. You pull your hand back and look at it. A scratch maybe a centimeter long. On the back of your left hand between the knuckles, it bleeds a little. You wipe it on your legging and keep moving. You will be dead in 8 days. Not from the scratch itself, not directly, but from a chain of events that the scratch initiated, a chain that your body in this time and place has almost no reliable way of stopping. And understanding that chain is understanding something profound about what it meant to be alive before the era of medicine, which is to say for all but the last blink of human existence. This is the story of 3 prehistoric death sentences, 3 ordinary situations. Situations your ancestors encountered every week or every month that carried a realistic probability of ending their lives. Not certainty, not even likelihood in every case, but a probability that hovered close enough to certain that death from these causes was not a tragedy in the ancient world. It was the expected outcome. It was what happened, and it happened constantly enough that it shaped the entire architecture of how early humans organized their societies, their knowledge systems, their rituals, and their relationships. The first death sentence is the one you just encountered, a wound. Not a serious wound, not a deep cut from a blade or a puncture from a tusk. A scratch, a small abrasion. The kind of thing you treat with a band-aid now and forget about within 2 days in the Paleolithic. That scratch was an open door into your body and what lived on your skin. In the soil, on the thorn, in the air, and on every surface you touched from that moment forward was standing in the doorway. The bacteria responsible for most fatal wound infections in the pre-antibiotic world were not exotic, they were not rare. They were Staphylococcus aureus, Streptococcus pyogenes, Clostridium perfringens, and Clostridium tetani. These are organisms that exist in soil, on human skin, in animal feces, in water, on plant surfaces, and on almost every object a foraging human would handle in a day. The moment a wound breached the skin barrier, the clock started. Medical historian Roy Porter, in his landmark survey of disease and medicine through history, estimated that wound infection was responsible for more human deaths than any other single cause prior to the 20th century, more than plague, more than famine, more than warfare itself. When you factor in the infectious deaths from battlefield wounds, rather than the wounds directly, a scratch in a world without antiseptic, without antibiotics, without any reliable method of preventing bacterial colonization of damaged tissue, was a genuine emergency. Your body's immune system was the only thing standing between that scratch and sepsis, and the immune system, while extraordinary, loses that fight with regularity. What happened in the body was this: the scratch introduced bacteria into the subcutaneous tissue. The immune system mobilized inflammation, redness, warmth, swelling around the wound. If the immune system won in the first 48 hours, you lived. If the bacterial load overwhelmed the initial response, the infection spread into the deeper tissue. You developed fever as your body raised its temperature to try to kill the bacteria. The fever took energy. Energy in a Mesolithic winter was not a surplus you could afford to spend on fighting infection. You were already burning more calories than you were consuming on many days. The fever that your body needed to fight the infection was simultaneously weakening the body that needed to fight it by day 4 or 5. The infection was either resolved, or it had entered the bloodstream. Sepsis in the modern hospital has a mortality rate of 15 to 30%, even with full antibiotic treatment and intensive care. Without antibiotics, without sterile saline, without vasopressors, without an intensive care unit, the mortality rate from established sepsis was close to 80% or higher from a scratch. What did your ancestors do about wound infection? They did everything they could. And some of it worked some of the time. Archaeological evidence and ethnographic study of surviving traditional cultures reveals the application of honey, which contains hydrogen peroxide and has genuine antimicrobial properties. Certain mosses were used as wound packing and have since been confirmed to have antimicrobial compounds, clay poultices. The chewing of specific plant matter and application of the resulting paste. Some of these interventions genuinely help. None of them were reliable, none of them could stop established sepsis. Your ancestors were working without the conceptual framework of germ theory, doing their best with pattern recognition and accumulated herbal knowledge. And sometimes winning, and often losing, the second death sentence requires you to do something that you will almost certainly do today, and probably did yesterday and will do again tomorrow. You will drink water 10,000 years ago. Finding water was not a problem. Mesolithic Europe and Africa were not water-scarce environments. Rivers, streams, springs, lakes, water was available. The problem was not water. The problem was what was in it. Giardia lamblia. A single-celled parasite causes giardiasis, a disease characterized by severe diarrhea, nausea, abdominal cramping, and dehydration. It is transmitted through water contaminated with fecal matter from infected animals or humans, which describes essentially every natural water source that was shared with any wildlife or used by any human group. The cysts of Giardia can survive in cold water for months. They are invisible to the naked eye. They have no smell. The water looks clean. Cryptosporidium parvum causes a similar disease with similar transmission. Entamoeba histolytica causes amoebic dysentery, which can progress to liver abscess and fatal systemic infection. Typhoid caused by Salmonella typhi is transmitted through contaminated water and food and carries without treatment. A case fatality rate of approximately 10 to 30%, but the most significant waterborne killer in the pre-modern world was not a parasite. It was cholera or its predecessors, Vibrio cholerae, and related organisms that caused the rapid, catastrophic dehydration that kills within hours to days if untreated. The mechanism of death from cholera is not the bacteria itself, but the loss of fluid. The body loses water and electrolytes faster than any untreated human can replace them. Death from cholera without treatment occurs in approximately half of severe cases, often within 24 hours. Researcher Randolph Ness, in his work on evolutionary medicine, published with George Williams, has argued that the extraordinary capacity of humans to lose water rapidly through diarrhea when infected with enteric pathogens is actually a defensive mechanism, the body trying to flush out the pathogen before it establishes itself. The problem is that the defense can kill you faster than the pathogen. What did your ancestors do? They boiled water when they had fire. They recognized over generations, without knowing why, that water from certain sources was safer than others. They used social knowledge, the group memory, to track which springs were reliable and which river bends were not. But fire was not always available. Boiling requires a container and fuel and time. On the move in winter, in unfamiliar territory, your ancestors drank what was available, and they paid for it regularly. The third death sentence is the quietest of the three. It does not come from a wound or from water. It comes from time. It comes from childbirth. For most of human history, pregnancy was a life-threatening condition, not metaphorically, not statistically in the aggregate sense, where we say all activities carry some risk, literally, concretely, personally threatening to the life of the woman experiencing it. Before modern obstetric care, the maternal mortality rate, the rate at which women died from pregnancy and childbirth complications, ranged from approximately 1 to 2% per birth in historical populations with some medical knowledge, to as high as 5 to 10% in the most vulnerable circumstances. 1 to 2% per birth sounds manageable, until you consider that a woman in the Mesolithic would typically become pregnant every 3 to 4 years between the ages of roughly 15 and 45, producing 6 to 10 pregnancies over her reproductive lifetime. A maternal mortality rate of 1.5% per birth, applied across 7 pregnancies, gives a cumulative mortality risk of approximately 10%. 1 in 10 women who reached reproductive age in the ancient world died in childbirth or from its direct complications. The leading cause was hemorrhage. Postpartum hemorrhage, uncontrolled bleeding after delivery, is the leading cause of maternal death worldwide even today. In countries without access to modern obstetric care, the uterus fails to contract properly after delivery, the blood vessels that supplied the placenta remain open, and the woman bleeds out within hours without oxytocin, without blood transfusion, without surgical intervention. Hemorrhage was almost always fatal. Once established, the second leading cause was infection. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, swept through populations in the ancient world with a regularity that made childbirth one of the most feared events in a woman's life. The bacteria responsible were the same streptococcal organisms responsible for wound infection. The birth canal, like any open wound, was an entry point, the hands of the attendant, the materials used to assist the birth, the environment in which the birth occurred, all carried bacterial load. A woman who survived delivery was not safe. She remained at risk for days afterward. The third cause was obstructed labor. The human infant has the largest head relative to the birth canal of any primate. This is the direct consequence of the evolutionary rapid expansion of the human brain. A baby whose head is too large to pass through the pelvic outlet will cause a labor that stalls, a uterus that exhausts itself, and without surgical intervention, a mother and infant who both die. The ancient solution to obstructed labor in many traditional cultures was techniques for manual rotation and extraction that sometimes worked and sometimes did not. Your ancestors knew all of this. They knew it the way you know that cars can kill you, not as abstract statistical knowledge, but as lived witnessed. Personal experience. Every woman who reached adulthood in the ancient world had watched someone die in childbirth. The rituals, the ceremonies, the social structures that surrounded pregnancy and birth in every documented hunter-gatherer culture were not superstition, they were the accumulated response of communities that had learned over thousands of generations that birth was a crisis, requiring the full attention and knowledge of the group. Now come back to the morning in the forest, the scratch on your hand, the water you drank from the stream 2 hours before you found the thorn, the fact that your partner is 7 months pregnant, and you are thinking about what you will need to gather before the birth. These 3 threads run through every day of prehistoric life, not as special occasions, not as rare emergencies, but as the permanent background condition of what it meant to be alive. Your body was not fragile. Your ancestors were extraordinary physical specimens, lean and strong, and adapted to their environment in ways that no modern human fully matches. But their bodies were operating without the layer of protection that germ theory and antisepsis and antibiotics and modern obstetric care have provided. And here is what makes this more than just a catalog of ancient dangers. Every one of these death sentences shaped something specific in how your ancestors lived. The reality of wound infection is why Mesolithic bands developed the botanical knowledge of wound treatment that we are only now fully mapping. It is why the role of healer existed in every documented human society. It is why being injured was a social event, not a private one. The group gathered around the injured member because the group's survival depended on that member's survival, and the group's accumulated knowledge was the only treatment available. The reality of waterborne disease is why the social memory of safe water sources was so carefully transmitted, and so tightly held. It is why certain springs were sacred in cultures across the world. Not because the ancients were superstitious, but because they had learned at the cost of lives exactly which water sources were reliably safe, and the most powerful encoding for that knowledge was ritual and story. The reality of maternal mortality is why childbirth in the ancient world was attended by the most experienced women in the group, why the knowledge of birth was the most carefully transmitted female knowledge in any community, and why the death of a woman in childbirth was not just a personal tragedy, but a community emergency. She carried knowledge. She carried relationships. She carried future children who would not now be born. You survived today. You came home from the forest with your scratch and your thirst and your worry. And your group gathered around you, and the elder woman looked at your hand and chewed the bark she always kept and packed it against the wound. And you sat near the fire, and your partner sat beside you, and neither of you said the things you were both thinking about because there was no point in saying them. You were alive, that was the thing. Right now, tonight, with the fire going and the group around you, you were alive. Tomorrow would decide the rest.